If you look closely at the timelines of history's greatest superpowers, a terrifying pattern begins to emerge from the noise of battles and treaties. It is a rhythm so precise that it feels almost biological, a lifespan that seems coded into the very DNA of human civilization. Whether it was the Assyrians marching out of the cradle of civilization, the Persians commanding the ancient world, the Romans building a civilization that would echo for millennia, the British Empire upon which the sun never set, they all share one haunting statistic. They all lasted, with frightening regularity, for approximately 250 years. This is the shelf life of a superpower. It is 10 generations from the first pioneer to the final collapse. And if you overlay this template onto the current global hegemon, the United States and the Western financial order established in 1945, you realize that we are not merely living through a turbulent decade. We are watching the sand run out of the hourglass. We are at year 248. To understand why this happens, we must strip away the day-to-day chaos of political headlines and look at the deep currents of economic history. The collapse of an empire is rarely an event. It is a process, and it always follows the exact same script. It does not begin with an explosion, but with a quiet shift in psychology and a subtle rot in the currency. It begins when a civilization stops valuing the men who build things and begins worshiping the men who manipulate money. This is the story of the 250-year cycle. The hidden mechanics of imperial suicide and the unmistakable signals that the next great turn of the wheel is already underway. The most comprehensive analysis of this phenomenon comes from a British military commander and scholar named Sir John Glubb. In his seminal 1978 work, The Fate of Empires*, Glubb analyzed over 3,000 years of historical data. He looked at the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Roman Republic, the Arab Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Spanish Empire, and the Romanovs. Despite vast differences in technology, religion, and geography, the average lifespan of these periods of dominance was 244 years. This consistency suggests that empires are not static structures, but organic entities with a life cycle: birth, energetic youth, maturity, senility, and death. Glubb identified distinct stages that every great power passes through. It begins with the Age of Pioneers, a breakout period, led by courageous, stoic individuals who have little to lose and everything to gain. They are characterized by shared sacrifice and a unified moral purpose. This leads to the Age of Conquests, where military discipline secures territory and resources. This is followed by the Age of Commerce, where the empire leverages its security to build vast trade networks, accumulating massive wealth. This wealth ushers in the Age of Affluence. This is the peak. Standards of living rise, art and architecture flourish, and the brutality of the pioneer age is forgotten. But affluence carries a poison pill. As wealth compounds, the character of the population changes. The shared purpose dissolves into individualism. Duty is replaced by entitlement. And crucially, the economy shifts from production to financialization. We are currently deep inside what Glubb called the final stage, the Age of Decadence. This stage is defined by specific economic markers that are flashing red in the global financial system today. The first marker is an explosion of debt that cannot mathematically be repaid. When an empire enters its decline, it invariably tries to maintain its standard of living and its military reach by borrowing against the future. In ancient Rome, this manifested as the debasement of the silver denarius to pay the legions. In the later stages of the Spanish Empire, it was the endless borrowing of gold, from foreign bankers to fund wars in the Netherlands. In the modern era, it is the United States reaching a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 120%, forcing the Treasury to issue trillions in bonds just to pay the interest on previous borrowing. The mechanism is identical. Only the instruments have changed. This transition from real wealth to debt-fueled illusion is subtle at first. In the Age of Commerce, the wealthy are merchants and manufacturers, people who create value. In the Age of Decadence, the heroes of the economy are speculators, bankers, and bureaucrats. The financial sector cannibalizes the productive economy. We saw this in the Dutch Golden Age in the 1700s, as Dutch naval dominance waned and their manufacturing competitiveness declined against the British. The Dutch elite retreated into finance. Amsterdam remained the banking capital of the world, even as the empire collapsed. They became the creditors to their rivals, lending money to the British, who would eventually usurp them. This financialization of decline is exactly what we witness today in London and New York. When an empire can no longer outproduce its rivals, it uses its control over the global reserve currency to extract wealth through financial engineering. It is a strategy that works for a few decades, extending the twilight, but it ultimately hollows out the core of the nation. The parallels to the Roman experience are particularly chilling when we examine the currency mechanics. Under Augustus, the Roman denarius was approximately 95% pure silver. It was a sound money standard that facilitated trade across the known world. By the time of Marcus Aurelius marking the end of the Pax Romana, the silver content had been shaved down to roughly 75%. This was manageable inflation. But as the empire faced civil wars, plagues, and border incursions, the emperors chose the path of least resistance: money printing. By the time of Emperor Gallienus, in the late 3rd century, the denarius was only 5% silver, essentially a bronze coin washed in a thin layer of silver that would rub off in your hand. The result was hyperinflation that destroyed the Roman middle class, wiped out the savings of the citizenry, and forced the economy to revert to barter. Today, we do not clip coins. We adjust digital ledgers. Since the decoupling of the US dollar from gold in 1971, the moment the American empire moved fully into the financialization phase, the dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power relative to gold. This is the modern equivalent of the debased denarius. The Federal Reserve, much like the Roman imperial mints, has been tasked with an impossible mandate: keep the empire solvent by creating liquidity out of thin air. But history shows that every time a reserve currency is weaponized to fund deficits without production, the result is a loss of trust. And trust is the only asset a fiat currency actually possesses. The mechanism of this modern decline is rooted in the Tryphon dilemma, an economic paradox identified in the 1960s. It states that the country issuing the global reserve currency must run persistent trade deficits to supply the world with enough money to conduct trade. To keep the world greased with dollars, the US must buy more than it sells. Over decades, this hollows out the domestic manufacturing base, shipping jobs and industrial capacity to the periphery, to places like Germany, Japan, and now China. The core empire becomes a consumer, while the rising rivals become producers. This creates a fatal imbalance. The empire becomes dependent on its rivals for physical goods, while the rivals accumulate the empire's debt. It is a symbiotic relationship that works until the rival decides they no longer want the debt. We are now witnessing the breakdown of this arrangement. The rise of the BRICS nations and the increasing move toward trade settlements in local currencies is the geopolitical equivalent of the provinces refusing to accept Roman coinage. When Saudi Arabia considers selling oil in yuan, or when central banks globally buy gold at a record pace, the highest rate since 1967, they are voting against the current cycle. They are preparing for the transition. This is not merely political posturing. It is a recognition that the 250-year clock is ticking. The exorbitant privilege of the dollar is facing the mathematical reality of compound interest and geopolitical overreach. But the death of an empire is not just about money. It is about the fracturing of society. Glubb noted that, in the Age of Decadence, the population becomes obsessed with frivolity, celebrity, and internal conflict. The shared moral code that bound the pioneers together shatters into warring factions. Politics becomes polarized not over policy, but over identity. In 18th century France, just before the Revolution and the collapse of the monarchy, the aristocracy was obsessed with court intrigue and theoretical debates, while the price of bread consumed 90% of a peasant's income. In late Rome, the mobs of the Colosseum demanded bread in circuses, free food, and violent entertainment to distract them from their lack of economic agency. The state provided it, knowing that a distracted populace is less dangerous than a hungry one. Today, we see the acceleration of this internal decay. The wealth gap in the United States has returned to levels not seen since the Gilded Age or the 1929 peak. The asset-owning class has benefited from the Federal Reserve's monetary inflation, which pushes up stock and real estate prices, while the wage-earning class has seen their purchasing power eroded by the rising cost of living. This is the classic recipe for the internal strife that marks the end of a cycle. When the social contract breaks, the unwritten agreement that hard work leads to a better life, the citizenry turns on the institutions. Trust in government, media, and banks collapses. This is the loss of legitimacy phase, where the empire is still powerful militarily, but has lost the consent of its own people. The danger of this phase is that declining empires rarely go quietly. As the economic engine sputters, the state often turns to increased authoritarianism and external conflict to maintain control. We saw this in the British Empire's desperate attempts to hold on to the Suez Canal in 1956, a humiliation that exposed its bankruptcy to the world. We saw it in the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, a final projection of power that drained its last resources before the collapse in 1991. The pattern suggests that as the debt burden becomes unbearable, the temptation for a reset through war becomes overwhelming. War provides the ultimate excuse for censorship, capital controls, and the restructuring of liabilities. It allows the state to blame the economic collapse on an external enemy rather than decades of mismanagement. But the true mechanism of collapse is rarely as visible as a battlefield. While the eyes of the public are fixed on political theater and foreign adversaries, the real war is being fought in the quiet, air-conditioned rooms of central banks and the opaque ledgers of the shadow banking system. To understand the acceleration phase, the moment where the slow decline suddenly becomes a free fall, we must understand the concept of asterisk complexity asterisk. The natural mechanism of the cycle demanded a correction at clearing, of bad debt and a failure of insolvent institutions. Instead, the architects of the system chose to freeze time. They injected trillions of dollars of liquidity into the veins of the economy, effectively banning failure. This decision marked the point of no return. By suppressing interest rates to zero and, even negative levels in Europe and Japan, central planners broke the fundamental pricing mechanism of capitalism. Capital, which is supposed to be treated as a scarce resource, became free for the elite. This unleashed what economists call the Cantillon effect. Discovered by Richard Cantillon in the 18th century, this principle states that who gets the new money asterisk first, asterisk matters. When the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank prints money, it does not rain down on the population equally. It flows first to the primary dealer banks, the hedge funds, and the corporate giants. They use this cheap capital to buy asset stocks, real estate, and competitors before inflation drives prices up. By the time this new money circulates down to the wage earner, it has already diluted the currency. Prices have risen, but wages have not. This is not an accidental byproduct of policy. It is a structural mechanism of wealth transfer. It explains why during the pandemic, the world's billionaires added trillions to their net worth while the global middle class was decimated. This artificial suspension of gravity creates a phenomenon known as the Seneca cliff. The Roman philosopher Seneca noted that increases are of sluggish growth, but the way to ruin is rapid, in economic terms. This means that while it takes decades to build an empire's wealth, the dissolution of that wealth can happen in a matter of days. We are currently standing on the edge of that cliff. The signals are flashing in the bond markets, the deepest and most honest financial markets in the world. In the 1930s, as the British pound lost its dominance, the world fractured into competing currency blocks, leading to trade wars that eventually turned into hot wars. Today, we see the formation of a parallel system. The weaponization of the SWIFT payment system kicking nations out of the dollar network was a tactical victory, but a strategic suicide for the United States. It signaled to every nation outside the Western Alliance that their dollar reserves were not safe. If your money can be frozen because of a geopolitical disagreement, it is no longer money. It is a political leash. Consequently, we are seeing the return of the real for 40 years. The global economy has been driven by financialization paper assets, derivatives, and digital promises. But in the final stage of the cycle, reality reasserts itself. You cannot eat Bitcoin, you cannot heat your home with a stock certificate, and you cannot build a tank with a derivative. The nations that control the atom's energy, food, metals, manufacturing capacity begin to exert leverage over the nations that control the bits. This is why the strategic alliance between energy giants like Russia and manufacturing giants like China is not a temporary marriage of convenience. It is the structural alignment of the commodity world against the financial world. This leads us to the inevitable climax of the 250-year cycle, the reset. Throughout history, when the debt burden becomes mathematically impossible to pay, there are only two ways out. The first is a hard default, where the government admits it is bankrupt, wipes out the bondholders, and the economy collapses into a deflationary depression. This is honest, but politically fatal. No government chooses this voluntarily. The second option, and the one chosen by almost every dying empire in history, is soft default via inflation. They print the difference, pay back their debts in currency that is worth a fraction of what it was when they borrowed it. They sacrifice the currency to save the state. We are already watching this choice play out. The surge in inflation is not transitory. It is the sound of the debt being inflated away. It is a slow-motion default on the savings of the citizenry. The big truth that every viewer must internalize is that the money in your bank account is not a store of value.
Ow.
It is a medium of exchange that is being systematically programmed to lose value.
Ow.
The system is designed to penalize savers and bail out debtors. In the final years of the cycle, holding fiat currency is akin to holding a melting ice cube. However, this diagnosis should not induce panic, but rather preparation. The collapse of an empire is not the end of the world. It is the end of an *era*. The fall of Rome was a catastrophe for the Roman elite, but for many in the provinces, life went on. In fact, for some, the removal of the heavy imperial tax burden was a liberation. The 250-year cycle is a forest fire, terrifying and destructive. Yes, but also a necessary ecological function that clears out the dead wood of a stifling, bureaucratic and debt-ridden system to make room for new growth. Those who understand this cycle do not try to stop the avalanche. They move out of its path. They diversify out of the dying currency. They acquire tangible assets, land, gold, commodities, productive businesses that have intrinsic value regardless of who sits on the throne. They build resilient communities that are less dependent on the complex, fragile supply chains of the global empire. They become, in effect, the pioneers of the next cycle. Images of a ticking clock, fading into a sunrise over a modern city. The visual tone shifts from dark and gritty to a golden, harsh morning light. We are at minute 11:59 on the imperial clock. The signs are everywhere for those willing to see them. The debasement of the currency, the polarization of society, the overextension of the military, and the desperate printing of money to delay the inevitable. The cycle does not care about our politics, our hopes, or our fears. It moves with the cold precision of a tidal wave. The American century is ending,